Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I came across a study yesterday, and I found it because of Greg Knuckles' page. And this is an interesting study, and I want to state up front, even though this is going to be another one of these videos that show that isolation movements just aren't that effective. I'm not telling people not to do isolation movements. I need to make that clear up front. And people will always make all their ad hominem attacks, like, oh, no isolation movements, why you don't have massive biceps, even though guys know I've done curls for years and years and years, and my biceps still, tend to lag. It's just the nature of my individual genetics. So that being said, I'm not telling people not to do isolation movements, but what we keep finding is that if I were to be purely evidence-based and we were to go on nothing but the science, none of us would ever do an isolation movement again. If we didn't base it upon the fact that we've seen people make improvements using them in the real world, no one would ever bother to isolate anything if we, again, went purely based upon the evidence, because they appear to be, scientifically speaking, kind of a waste of time other than bringing up a lagging muscle group. But let's go ahead and look at what this study shows. And what I've done, I'm just going to put clips of it in here because some people say, Jason, why don't you cite your sources? Because I've gotten into trouble with YouTube on that. They don't like me making videos about studies and then linking the study underneath. But you guys have got the title of the study right there. You can find it with Google very, very easily based upon what you see in the abstract up above. Now what they did, they took 36 soccer players and they wanted to compare if they put them on an all multi-joint, which is a compound movement, versus an all single joint routine, which is isolation, what would happen? Now, we know in the real world, no one ever runs an all isolation movement program. Well, I say that, but there have been bodybuilding gurus who recommend that, by the way. Just throwing that out there, that actually has been done. No one does it today. But in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there were certain people like Vince Gironda who were against compound movements, right? They were against compound movements other than a couple, and the ones that they did recommend tended to be really dangerous, stupid ones. So you've got to keep that in mind. But they wanted to compare this and look at a few different factors, and so they put together a basic 3-day-a-week program, and I'll go ahead and put that up above for you guys to see. And that program consisted of a 3-day-a-week split, and it did 4 sets of each exercise. And what they tried to do was make the overall volume equal so that they could see what happened, because we know that volume seems to be the primary driver of hypertrophy. And so as you guys can see, every muscle got hit with a compound movement or got hit with an isolation movement. Now, obviously, they needed more exercises to do the isolation stuff. They needed a few more exercises to get there because, obviously, you need more exercises if you're going to try to isolate things. Now, arguably, not every muscle got completely isolated particularly well, and I will take that into account when we look at some of the results in a minute, because realistically speaking, a side lateral doesn't work all 3 heads of the delt. So again, you're not getting as much total body part training happening here, because again, not every single muscle in the body got isolated. Most of the major ones did, but I think realistically speaking, we all realize there's a lot of muscles that didn't get worked on the isolation movement, and we can account for that in the results as far as the body composition goes, because I'm going to note something with that when we hop over to the results in a minute. And I'll go ahead and flip those results in so you guys can see what I'm talking about. And for those curious how they measured stuff, it's all in their findings. You can read through the study to see how they took all the measurements, but they did DEXA scan studies. They gave very strict instructions on people on how to avoid messing up the DEXA scans, because we do know the way that you hydrate the day before and certain supplements and foods can actually interfere with the accuracy of a DEXA scan. So they had instructed all the people on this, and that's how they had checked body composition. Now they're claiming body composition was the same. That was the only thing in which the isolation movements matched the compound movements. The only thing in which they matched it. But it's interesting that it only ran 8 weeks, and that's important. And a lot of people will say, well, it's hard to do fun studies longer than that. It's hard to get adherence, and that's true. But what is it that coaches note in the world? Tons of strength and conditioning coaches have noted that it is hard to train isolation movements more than 6 to 8 weeks. In other words, progressive overload stops. If you don't do any compounds for a body part, let's say you're not doing any sort of chin-ups and rows and you just try to do curls, your curls will stall at about 6 to 8 weeks and they will stop increasing even if you try to periodize them. You need compound movements in there to progress because single joint exercises don't train, they don't adapt the same because our body's not designed to work that way. We have to make these movements up. They're not natural patterns, and for some reason, single joint exercises don't continue to have progress for months and months. They stall very, very quickly. And again, it could be argued because our body's nervous system isn't really designed to do them. They're not really part of our normal movement patterns, like compound movements. But what they noted was that they claimed the body composition changes were comparable, but they really weren't. The compound movement group gained twice as much muscle. They gained double the muscle. So again, that needs to be noted, but these muscle gains were small because we're talking like 2 kilos versus 4 kilos. But you got to remember, that's a lot. But that's also going to have glycogen and other stuff involved, all these transient storage factors. But I will say that because the isolation movements didn't hit every muscle, meaning they probably needed 5 or 6 more isolation movements to actually work every muscle. So I think we'll live with that and say, okay, even though the conclusion showed that the compound group gained more muscle, when they probably looked at it, individual muscles trained probably did. In other words, the biceps probably didn't grow more from the lat pull downs and rows than they did the curls. The chest probably didn't grow more from the bench press and the flies if they looked at individual muscles with MRI and stuff. And I think that's probably going to account for the differences, is that things like traps and certain aspects of the core and maybe the glutes and other things, which are relatively big muscles, didn't get the same stimulation. So we can account for that. They did note again, body composition was comparable between the two, but when you look at the chart, the compound group gained more muscle and lost more fat, at least according to the DEXA scans. What's interesting is that, so they're saying that body composition, they're pretty comparable, but again, it's going to take more time to do the isolation movements. What's interesting is that when we go to performance, because this is the big deal, and this is kind of a damning point when it comes to isolation movements. The compound group gained better VO2 max, so in other words, they got better carryover to their conditioning and endurance, which makes sense. I mean, a squat versus a leg extension and a leg curl. You know, a bench press versus a fly and a tricep press down. Of course, you're involving more muscle. You're going to get better carryover to your endurance. And we know strength training carries over to endurance. But that's not surprising. What was surprising was the strength difference. And what I mean is that, yes, the compound group obviously got stronger on the compound movements. Right, that's common sense. You would expect training the bench press to make your bench press go up more than flies and tricep extensions would, right? Common sense, same thing with a squat. But they tested an isolation movement also, and I really wish they had tested more of the isolation movements, because this is a really interesting point. The compound group gained more strength on the isolation movement, the leg extension, than the leg extension group did. So now we're getting back over to a point about specificity of training, because what is it that we always do? And powerlifting has adopted the bodybuilding approach sometime back, and a lot of powerlifters will do isolation movements to make a muscle stronger for a compound, right? But in this case, the compound movements made the individual muscle stronger even on the isolation movements and training the isolation movement did. In other words, we would expect if you train an exercise to get stronger on that exercise from the same muscle gain versus if you gained muscle from a different exercise, wouldn't we? That's what specificity of training tells us, but that's not what happened. Squats improved the leg extension more than doing the leg extension did. So what this is showing is that across the board, compound movements improve performance, both strength and endurance, more than isolation movements do. And that's the interesting point. Maybe that's one reason that people struggle if they only do isolation movements who do them. In other words, you see guys who get stronger on curls year after year, right? But they're usually doing compound movements that involve the biceps too. What we know from observing when they only do the isolation movements, their strength stalls. So in other words, maybe the fastest way to get stronger on your curls is to do chin-ups and rows, not the curls themselves. And that's almost what this would suggest, because again, we only saw it with the legs, and I wish they had done it with some of the arm stuff and the pecs. That would have been really interesting. But this also starts to question the fact of, if this is the case, and this gets replicated in other studies, if compound movements make individual muscles stronger than isolating those muscles, why are we bothering to isolate those muscles for strength purposes? Shouldn't we be finding an extra compound movement to do instead? In other words, is a tricep press down really going to help your bench press by increasing tricep strength if we know that a compound movement like a weighted dip or a closed grip bench press will improve tricep strength more even on the tricep extension than doing the tricep extension will? If this is true, this would make isolation movements for strength purposes pretty much obsolete. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.